Samai. Most people imagine King Arthur's world as profoundly Christian, a pious king and humble knights questing for the Holy Grail. And that's certainly one version of the story, and a powerful one. But the earliest sources tell a very different tale. In the early Welsh texts, Arthur is the fierce leader of a wonder-working warband. He raids the Otherworld for a dangerous cauldron that does not boil a coward's food. He hunts monstrous boars and orders the kingdom and the cosmos according to his own law. Then the later romances transformed these native Welsh symbols into quite common Christian ones that became popular across the whole of Europe. The cauldron becomes the Eucharistic Grail. The Otherworld became a Christian paradise. The quest stopped being a raid for treasure and became a pilgrimage for grace. Think of these two traditions, the native Welsh and the later English and French and German romances, as two different economies of power. In the first, you earn your place through skill and action and courage. In the second, you ultimately receive your place through God's grace. And this tells us something about the cultures that shape these stories. And perhaps more importantly, what happens when one set of values gets translated into another. I'm going to talk through how that shift happened, but if you want more of the Welsh backdrop and a wider survey of the sources, I cover that in the earlier video, Arthur's Myth. Most people have heard of the Holy Grail, but few know how the story came about. In the late 12th century, the French poet Chrétien de Troyes presented it as part of a mysterious courtly ritual in his long poem Percival. But in that earlier scene, he never actually tells us what the Grail is. In Percival, a mysterious procession passes before the young knight. A bleeding lance and a luminous vessel that somehow keeps a wounded king alive. The moment is charged with meaning, but Chrétien leaves that meaning perhaps deliberately unclear. A maiden was carrying a grail with her two hands. She was beautiful, noble, and richly attired. After she had entered the hall carrying the grail, the room was so brightly illumined that the candles lost their brilliance like stars in the moon when the sun rises. The grail was of fine, pure gold. Set in the grail were precious stones of many kinds, the best and costliest to be found in earth or sea. The grail stones were finer than any others in the world, without any doubt. Later in the poem, a hermit explains the vessel's power in explicitly Christian terms. The Fisher King, maimed and unable to leave his hall, is kept alive by what it contains. A single consecrated host, the wafer of Christian communion, carried in this mysterious grail, and it sustains his life. A single host that is brought to him in that grail sustains and brings comfort to that holy man. Such is the holiness of the grail. So what had been a mysterious serving dish becomes something sacramental. But Chrétien still doesn't tell us it's the Holy Grail, the cup from the Last Supper of Christ. That final step was taken by someone else. Now, within a generation of Chrétien writing Percival, another French poet by the name of Robert de Boron had completed the transformation. What Chrétien had left mysterious and unnamed, Robert made explicit and historical. The Grail becomes the chalice used at the Last Supper and the cup that caught Christ's blood at the crucifixion. Which means in less than 30 years, a mysterious serving vessel in a Welsh-inspired French romance became the most sacred relic in Christendom. Now, scholars have debated for a century or more where the idea of the Grail comes from. Of course, a very popular theory is that it was originally the magic cauldron of Celtic myth. The Celtic cauldron becoming the Christian Grail isn't the only transformation we find in Arthurian romances. The same pattern of 9 otherworldly women guarding a source of power appears in both the native Welsh and Christian versions of Arthur's story. Only the second time around, the 9 sisters have been thoroughly baptised. In the 11th century Welsh poem Perilous, on a distant otherworldly island, 9 maidens keep a magic cauldron warm with nothing but their breath. The other peculiarity of this cauldron is that it has a mind of its own. It apparently judges courage. The cauldron kindled by the breath of 9 maidens. The cauldron of the head of Anon. What is its disposition, with its dark trim and pearls? It does not boil a coward's food. It has not been destined to do so. A few generations later, in his story The Vita Merlini, the Anglo-Norman author Geoffrey of Monmouth gives us a very similar story. The paradise otherworld of Avalon is ruled by 9 sisters, led by Morgen, a healer, scholar and shapeshifter. Everything grows in abundance and men live there for 100 years or occasionally more. 9 sisters, benignly empowered, rule there over all those who arrive at that island from our lands. First and most skilled of them all, both in healing and beauty, is Morgen, who has a knowledge of plants, both their uses and curative powers. Such is her skill that she knows how to change her own shape. The 9 maidens who tend the Welsh cauldron and the 9 sisters who rule Avalon aren't simply there for decoration. They form what we might call a governing council, a body of wisdom that makes up part of the cosmic order. They heat the cauldron, measure worthiness, heal bodies, and preserve learning and wisdom. Avalon's 9 sisters represent a baptised version of what we find in Perilous, but as a council of mercy rather than a council of judging the brave. Now there's something important at work here. Wisdom, symbolically represented by the cauldron, requires careful tending. It can't be seized or held by a single person, however brilliant. It needs a chorus, a community of guardians, a council to watch over it together. The cauldron doesn't work without the breath of the 9 sisters. Avalon doesn't heal without their counsel. If you want to feel the full force of what changed when these Welsh myths were reinvented in Latin and English and French texts, you need to have a sense of the original. Before Geoffrey of Monmouth got his hands on Arthur, before the Christian romances turned him into a sacramental king, there was a different Arthur. Still the great leader, the warrior, but also a hero who got his hands dirty. This earliest Arthur is both poetic and mythic. He leads a hand-picked war band, not on a quest for God's grace, but for supernatural adventure. The poem that records his raid on the otherworld, Perilous, expresses a very different set of values to what we find in the later Grail romances. The magic cauldron Arthur seeks doesn't measure purity or faith. It's not concerned with whether you've confessed your sins or received grace. Instead, it measures courage. The cauldron responds to one thing in a warrior: the courage to face the other world and take what you came for. If you're a coward, the cauldron won't work for you. It's as simple and as brutal as that. In the poem, only 7 of Arthur's men survive the raid on the otherworld, which underscores how unforgiving this cauldron really is. This feels more like tribal wisdom, not necessarily religious wisdom. The cauldron embodies the values of a warrior culture where your worth depends on what you can do and who stands beside you. There's no penitential pathway to worthiness. You either have the nerve or you don't. And again, as the later authors of England, France and Germany replaced the cauldron with the Grail, some essential elements of the myth stayed the same. There's still a perilous vessel, a dangerous journey, a test of worthiness. But the meaning of the myth was fundamentally changed. What had been a mystical adventure to the otherworld became a spiritual test of Christian purity. A magic cauldron that boiled for the brave became a holy vessel from which only the pious could drink. If you're interested in tracking how these types of myths evolve and what's retained from the earlier Welsh mysticism in the later Christian Arthurian stories, then you're welcome to join us on the upcoming course, The Head and the Grail. Elsewhere in Welsh tradition, Arthur doesn't just raid the otherworld with his magic ship Prydwen. He also takes what he wants from this world when it suits him. In the early 12th century tale Culhwch and Olwen, we find Arthur doing exactly that. He and his warband board his ship, but this time sail to Ireland to seize a cauldron owned by a giant called Diwrnach. There's no negotiation, no diplomacy, no careful planning. Arthur's men simply fight the Irish, kill Diwrnach and carry away his cauldron as plunder. The hosts of Ireland came to fight them, and when all the hosts had fled, Arthur and his men boarded the ship before their very eyes, and the cauldron with them, full of Irish treasure. It reads almost like entries in a warrior's ledger, a record of who went where, who took what, and who died in the process. There's no moral commentary from the storyteller, no suggestion that Arthur should have behaved differently. This is simply what powerful leaders did when they needed something. They took it by force. This tale gives us the same pattern we saw in Prydau Annwn. A ship called Prydwen again, a hand-picked warband, a raid that succeeds through courage and violence. The cauldron is the prize, and the only question that matters is whether you're strong enough to take it. But there's something else worth noticing in Culhwch and Olwen. This tale doesn't just show us Arthur raiding for cauldrons. It also sets absurd, glorious tasks that test prowess, kinship and solidarity. The feats of heroism and cunning that Arthur and his men must perform, and sensible quests with practical goals. They're the kind of impossible challenges that will test whether you're worthy or not to join the ranks of legendary heroes. The Welsh Arthur's world is structured by different values to that of the later romances. In this light, the cauldron and the Grail might not just be magical objects. Each one establishes rules about who eats or drinks or who comes and goes, and ultimately who has power, be that God's grace or a mystic heroism. In other words, both vessels set the terms by which society operates. The cauldron that does not boil a coward's food sets up a particular kind of world where courage determines your place. The Grail that feeds the spiritually pure creates an entirely different world, one where grace and God's favour matters more than martial prowess. Change the vessel's rules, and you change the rules of the world. So this early Welsh Arthur is a man from a very different world to that of the Grail. He isn't a Christian king waiting for grace. He's a warrior, a leader, a raider who breaks into the otherworld and takes what he needs by force. He chooses expert companions and binds them through loyalty. When they sail in Prydwen or hunt monstrous boars, they're not on pilgrimage. There's no confession or penance required. But even after the later romances have left all of that behind, Arthur's myth still retains some of its older structures, even as it explores new meanings. That's how a raiding tale in early Welsh poetry becomes a spiritual quest across medieval Europe. If you want to know how deep the roots of Arthur's myth go, you're welcome to join us on the course The Head and the Grail. Diolch yn fawr.